What if, and there were suggestions about this, we move to wastewater, we move to recycling, we move to autonomy, we move to much more independence and different forms of interdependence. Well, then you move to a situation where our conception of supply and demand actually obscures where value added comes from. Because the critical thing about this is that who adds value? Where does the element that customizes and makes something valuable come from? And that's where unique production shifts the emphasis. If I'm, for whatever reason, want to cook my own food and have my own garden, and I have my own taste, I'm creating uniquely. And if because I'm networked, and I can have somebody solve my problem, then maybe my vertical farming works. And I can solve the problem of why my tomatoes are not, or why my new hybrid is not, or whatever. And so you begin to get a different way of thinking about supply and demand. And this becomes a crucial part of understanding the monetary economy and monetary subsistence, but also community-based collective goods and interdependence. So in part, what I heard in some of the presentations earlier was this notion that we move beyond the existing, rather monolithic organization of production. How does that happen? It happens by going beyond supply and demand. And when we imagine the future, and we only imagine it in terms of what's going on the supply side, what's going on the demand side, we are limiting our imagination. Because our language and our conceptual framework limits our imagination. So everybody knows this stuff now. This is 3D printing. It's just an illustration of why this kind of stuff is coming along. That these days we can move beyond the management execution, unique creation, networked just in time, do it yourself, refinement of taste and choice, experience and identity are part of unique creation. There's a word that I use for visual metaphor for this, which is called the murmuration. Murmuration is a group of birds flying around. Most of you have seen a murmuration before, I suppose. I'm not going to put one up on the screen, but it's clouds of unique creation. And this visual metaphor is meant to help you this afternoon and tomorrow morning to think about what it would be like to deal with water and urbanization in 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the context of a murmuration and not an industrial structure. This is post-industrial society. It's something where you have the ability to operationalize, and here I'm going to use another word, heterarchy. So my apologies to the interpreters, but heterarchy is the opposite of hierarchy. We are very good, generally speaking, at hierarchy. We know how to govern hierarchy, we know how to describe hierarchy, we know how to do statistics on the basis of hierarchy. We're very good at it. But heterarchy, which is quite straightforward, if you have somebody with a university degree and somebody with no education, and I say to you, the happiness of the uneducated person is much worse than the happiness of a well-educated person. You can say, are you crazy? That's ridiculous. And you're right. Because happiness is heterarchical. It's not hierarchical. It's something that has to do with your own way of seeing and being, and it can't be compared in a way that a hierarchical metric can be compared. We know relatively little about heterarchy, and we know very little about how to make decisions and think about heterarchy. But if we begin to look at systems where there's birth, death, entry, exit, where you go in and where you go out, where you become part of an economic system and a social system and a community, and you leave, and we begin to think about things in terms of well-being and the meaning of life rather than income, which has already been evoked. It was said earlier today that there'll always be income, high and low. But what if the meaning of income disappears? What if nobody cares what your income is? Because the basis for being and living changes. It's not based on income. Income didn't always exist because we didn't always have money. And we didn't always have jobs. So I'm just trying to loosen up our categories here and to move beyond it in terms of identity, capacity to be free, experience belonging and meaning, the way we invent different ways of creating this sense of engagement and the sense of rites of passage, all of these things change significantly over time. And one of the challenges for us when imagining the future is to let go of our colonization, to not colonize tomorrow with yesterday's basic concepts. So again, I'll give you a possibility space. It's just a little thing to think about. Scale of social affiliation, decisions, the kind of decisions. If you have homogeneous large groups with less choice, or you have heterogeneous and small groups with more choice, if you get to choose your lifestyle, if you get to choose what it means to be a brother, a sister, a parent, a grandparent, if you choose what it means to be a member of your community, these are things that you're making choices about. You have the challenge of making sense of all that. And so you have a learning-intensive society. It's quite intensive to learn about those things. It also gets us beyond the individual versus the collective. Because if you're in the context where you're continuously defining who you are, why should I wear a tie? Because you're here. It's always social. If you're creating your identity, and you're not just taking it from off the shelf, you have a burden, which can be very heavy and painful, and which is part of the, I think, the source of extremism today. The inability to respond to the challenge of having the freedom to define your identity. If you're not equipped and you can't create your identity, it's exceedingly painful, and you will fall back to some form of identity which is safe, reassuring, even if it kills you. So this gets us beyond the individual versus the collective when we think of the social, and all of it connects up to decision-making capacity, which has already been evoked in a number of cases in terms of how we think about both decision-making around water, but decision-making around urban systems and the community and the well-being of an urban community. And again, a possibility space. All things considered, if there's more transparency and access to information, and you have more chance to use it, more experimentation, in theory, this is an hypothesis, there's increasing returns to scale. So I'm using a technical term. Increasing returns to scale in this context means wisdom. Why? Because if you have more experience and you have more information, presumably you'll learn and you'll become wiser. I mean, it's a way of talking about wisdom. So this is a way, you'll forgive the economist's way, of portraying wisdom. And it's about the capacity for reframing and sense-making and spontaneity. Because you have the ability not to follow orders, but to figure things out because you become wiser. Which recovers the concept, lost in some contexts, of wisdom, which used to be central to the way we thought about the value of a society and the value of people. So, this is a way also of embracing complexity. It's a way of bringing together wisdom, creativity, spontaneity, complexity, and network fluidity. So imagine our informal urban places from this point of view. If we were using this as a policy framework, if we were testing our policies against these criteria, what do they do with respect to spontaneity, creativity, wisdom, complexity, network fluidity? We get this kind of context, where you have living knowledge, the stock, so the languages that people can speak, the languages that children learn, that's the flow. If they don't learn a language, it dies. If the children don't learn the language, so you have stocks and flow of learning. And we have ways of creating that knowledge. The public sector, the private sector, and of course, family, community, industry. And if we cover all of this, in effect we're talking about learning as practice, learning as doing, learning as community, learning as belonging, learning as identity, learning as becoming, learning as meaning,